Hello, everybody. Welcome to Storytime again from the Milledgeville Public Library of Illinois. The story we have for you today is a story about someone who was enchanted and then freed, and the family that he made then. This is a story that comes to us from East India, and this is the story of the Muchie Lal. Once long ago in eastern India, there was a Raja and a Rani, a prince and a princess, and they very, very much wanted children, but they didn't have any. And every day they prayed to the gods to give them children, but the gods did not answer. Well, one day, a batch of fish were delivered for the Raja's dinner, and one of the fish, much to the surprise of the servants, was still alive when it was delivered. And so one of the maids took that fish and she slipped it into a little dish of water so that it could swim about a little bit until they decided what to do with it. Well, it just so happened that the Rani, the princess, came by as the fish was swimming about in the dish, and she thought it was a very pretty fish and she thought she might keep it as a pet. Well, the Rani did just that. She had a great big fish tank built for it, and she put the pretty little fish in the water, and she fed it every day, and she gave it all of the love and affection that she would have given a child. And it grew, and grew, and grew. And as it grew, she had bigger and bigger and bigger tanks made for it, until the fish, which she called the Muchie Rani, which means the fish prince, that fish, the Muchie Rani, he got Muchie Raja. The Muchie Raja grew so big that news of him began to spread across the kingdom about how very big this fish prince was and about how very strong and terrible he was. Well, one day, when the Rani went to feed the Muchie Raja, much to her surprise, spoke to her, and he said, "Mother, won't you please find me a wife? I'm so very lonely. I would very much like to have a wife." Well, the Rani was rather startled at that, but she very much loved her Muchie Raja, and she would do anything for him. And so she sent out word across the kingdom that the Muchie Raja was looking for a wife. But it was not quite so easy to find him a wife as she first thought it might be. For you see, every family in the kingdom, from the richest on down to the poorest, did not want their daughters to be the wife of the Muchie Raja. They were afraid that the Muchie Raja would eat their daughters. Well, even after the Rani offered a bag of gold for someone to marry the Muchie Raja, no one seemed to want to do it. Until one day, when the messenger of the Rani arrived in a certain town, there was living in that town a fakir, a merchant and a nobleman, and he was away from home at the time, but he had a wife, and he had 2 daughters. But one of his daughters belonged to a wife who had died, and the other daughter belonged to the wife he had now. And the fakir's wife did not like her stepdaughter. She was jealous of her because she was very pretty and very gentle, and she thought that her husband, he was too partial to her, and he treated her so kindly, and he didn't treat her own daughter so kindly. She might have been right, she might not have been, but when the messenger came to the house, the fakir was away from town traveling, and so the fakir's wife said, "Oh, yes, give me that bag of gold. This is my stepdaughter. You may take her to be the Muchie Raja's wife." And she sent the girl to the river to wash her best sari so that she would look nice when she arrived at the palace the next day. Well, The poor girl didn't know what to do. She felt so scared. Everyone had heard of the Muchie Raja and how very big he was and how strong he was, and everybody said that he would just eat his wife. He wouldn't take care of her and he wouldn't treat her well. He would just eat her. So as she knelt by the riverbank washing her best sari, she started to cry. Now her tears, some of them fell into the river, but some of them fell into a hole just near the riverbank. And as it happened, what lived in that hole was a cobra with 7 heads. Well, that cobra saw the tears rolling down into its home, and it crawled up out of the hole and it said, "Young girl, why are you crying?" And she said, "Oh, I am so sorry. I did not mean to disturb you, cousin, but, well, my stepmother has sold me to the Rani to be the Muchie Raja's wife, and I am so afraid he will eat me. I'm so scared." Well, the cobra thought for a moment. She was a very wise cobra. You know, the Muchie Raja was not always a fish. In fact, once he was a handsome prince, but the gods were angry with him and they turned him into a fish. Now here's what you must do. Do you see these 3 white pebbles here by the riverbank? Take those with you, and if the Muchie Raja should rush towards you as if to eat you, throw the pebbles at him one at a time, and then we shall see. I think you shall be safe." "Thank you, cousin," said the girl, and the cobra crawled back into its hole. Now, the girl didn't really think that the cobra's pebbles were going to do much, but there was nothing wrong in taking them along with her. And so she took them up in her hand and she tied them into the corner of her sari and she went to the palace. Well, when she arrived at the palace, the Rani greeted her very kindly and she took her over and she set her into a basket, and then they lowered the basket down into a room next to a very big tank of water. The water came right up to the edge of the room. The room was filled with beautiful carpets and the walls were hung with delicate silks. And the girl thought, well, it's a very pretty place, and I am away from my stepmother and all of the chores and all of the beatings and the horrible treatment that she gave me. Perhaps I could be happy here. But just as she thought that, suddenly there was a rushing of water, and the waves began to ripple up to the edge of the room. And she looked up, and there, coming towards her on a wave, was a very big fish, and she knew it must be the Muchie Raja. And she was so scared, but she remembered what the cobra had said. And so she quickly reached down and she took one of the stones out of her sari and she threw the stone at the Muchie Raja. And hit the Muchie Raja and he sank to the bottom of the tank. But a little while later, he floated back up again and he came rushing toward her again, and she took the second stone and she threw it at the Muchie Raja and he sank to the bottom of the tank. And after a little while, he floated back up again and he started coming towards her again, and she took that last stone and she threw it at the Muchie Raja. And as soon as it hit him, suddenly he was no longer a fish, but instead a very handsome young man. Well, the poor girl was so relieved and so startled that she started to cry. And the Muchie Raja knelt down in front of her and he said, "Please don't cry. You've saved me. You've freed me from the evil spell that was holding me captive. Please, will you marry me? Will you be my wife?" And she said she would. And so they were married, and the Muchie Raja and the Muchie Rani began a very happy life together. Now, the Muchie Rani's stepmother came to visit her quite often, and she pretended to be very happy for her stepdaughter. But she kept telling her that she should come and visit her father, the fakir, because he really couldn't get away from his business in town, and so she should come and visit him. And, well, the Muchie Rani did miss her father quite a lot, and so eventually her stepmother persuaded her to come home and visit her father, the fakir. Well, the Muchie Raja, he knew that his wife missed her father, and so he let her go, but he said, "Do not stay long, for I shall not be happy until you come back." And she said, "I promise I will not stay long." And so she went home to visit her father. Now, when she got home and she was visiting with her father, her stepmother took her stepsister aside and she said, "Here is what you must do, daughter. You must take your stepsister down by the riverbank, and you must beg and implore her to let you try on her jewels. And when she gives you her jewels to try on, then you must push her into the river, and then she will drown, and we will be rid of her, and we will not have to deal with her anymore." And so the stepsister did what her mother said. She took her stepsister down by the riverbank, and she begged her to let her try on her jewels, and as soon as the Muchie Rani handed over her jewels, her stepsister pushed her into the river to drown. And she took the jewels and she ran home to her mother, and she said, "Mother, I've done what you said. Here are the jewels, and my stepsister shall bother us no longer." And her mother said, "Well done, my dear." And she dressed her daughter up in all of the Muchie Rani's jewels. And she took her back to the palace, and she gave her back to the Muchie Raja, and she said, "Here is your wife. I have brought her back safe and sound to you." Well, the Muchie Raja thought that she did not quite look like his wife, but it was late, and it was a bit dark, and so he said nothing. But the next morning, it became very clear that this was not the Muchie Rani. The Muchie Rani was pretty, and she was cheerful, and she was happy, and she was bright. And this girl, although she was pretty, she wasn't quite as pretty as the Muchie Rani, and she was rather sullen and grumpy, a little bitter. To the Muchie Raja, he said, "You are not my wife." And he took the jewels off of her, and he sent her home, and he sent his soldiers out to look for the fakir's wife. "If she cannot tell me where my wife is," he said, "then she will be hanged." But when they arrived in the fakir's village, the fakir's wife was nowhere to be found. She had disappeared. Well, you might wonder what happened to the Muchie Rani after her sister pushed her into the stream. She was sinking to the bottom of the river, and she didn't know what she was going to do. She was quite frightened, when suddenly something wrapped itself around her and pulled her back up to the surface. And much to her surprise, she found that it was the seven-headed cobra. It had been swimming in the river, and she had seen her fall in, and she had gone to rescue her. Well, the seven-headed cobra said, "You cannot go home now, my dear. It is too dangerous. Why don't you stay with me and my family?" And so the Muchie Rani did. And the cobra would do anything for the Muchie Rani, but she would not let the Muchie Rani leave. "It is too dangerous. You cannot go wandering about trying to find your husband. If he comes to find you, then you may go home with him. But it is too dangerous for you to just be wandering about the countryside. It would not be safe." And so she kept the Muchie Rani with her. And before too many months had passed, the Muchie Rani had a little baby, a little boy. And he was happy, and he was cheerful, and he was the prettiest child you ever seen. And the Muchie Rani named him Muchie Lal, which means ruby fish. And the Muchie Lal grew up with the cobra and the family, as he and his mother, the Muchie Rani, lived with the cobra in the cobra's hole. Well, when the Muchie Lal was about 3 years old, a bangle seller happened to walk past the cobra's hole, and he was jingling his bangles as he went. And the Muchie Rani heard them, and she knew that Muchie Lal would like to play with some bangle bracelets. That would be fun for him. And so she called to the bangle seller, and she bought some bangle bracelets for the Muchie Lal. Well, Muchie Lal was a lively child, and he liked to play and be very active while he was playing. And while he was playing, he broke all of his bangles, and he was rather sad. So the next day, his mother bought him more bangles, but he broke those too. And the next day, she bought him more bangles, and he broke those too. And the next day, yes, that happened for quite some time. Well, while the Muchie Rani and Muchie Lal were living with the cobra, what happened to the Muchie Raja, her husband? Well, he didn't just give up when he could not find the fakir's wife to tell him where his wife was. Oh, no, no, no. He began traveling about the countryside trying to find out if anyone had seen his wife, or heard anything about her, or knew where she might be. And while he was traveling, he happened to meet a bangle seller on the road. And the bangle seller and the Muchie Raja began to talk. And the bangle seller happened to mention that he had sold some bangles to a woman and a child who were living in a cobra hole. Well, that was unusual enough that the Muchie Raja was curious, and he asked the bangle seller who these people might be that lived in a cobra hole. And the bangle seller told the Muchie Raja, it's a woman and a child of about 3 years old. And he's the most beautiful child I've ever seen, and she is a very sweet and gentle woman. And, oh, the child's name is Muchie Lal. Well, the Muchie Raja got very excited when he heard that, and he said, Sir, please, you must take me to them. I really wish to meet this family that you are speaking of that lives with the cobras. Please take me there. And so the next day, the bangle seller did. When he approached the hole of the cobra hole where Muchie Rani and Muchie Lal lived, he began rattling his bangles. And out from the hole there came a voice, a young woman's voice. Muchie Lal, come quickly, the bangle seller is here. Let us come find you some bangles to play with. Well, the Muchie Raja, he knew that voice. That was the voice of his wife. And so he got down on his knees next to the hole and he called out, Wife, oh Muchie Rani, please come out to me. Well, the Muchie Rani heard his voice and she came running out of the hole and she said, Husband, you found me. You found me. And she hugged him tightly, and she introduced him to his son, the Muchie Lal. And they were so happy to be together again that even the seven-headed cobra and his family, who would miss the Muchie Rani and the Muchie Lal, they were very, very happy for them. And so the Muchie Raja took his wife, the Muchie Rani, and his son, the Muchie Lal, and they went back to the palace, and they lived very happily together. And that is the story of the Muchie Lal from East India. I hope you enjoyed it, and we will see you again on Monday at 3 p.m. Central Daylight Time here on the Milledgeville Public Library of Illinois Facebook page. We'll have another story for you. We'll see you later. Bye.